jumping into the news, just kidding. We're going into Hatseg Island. So Hatseg Island, this, I should mention, this was a request to talk about the Hatseg Basin from Jurassic Site B. So thank you for requesting that and giving us the idea. Hatseg Island was a large island in the Late Cretaceous located in the Tethys Sea between Laurasia and Gondwana.
Basically what is now Europe.
Yes. It's known for its basal dwarf dinosaurs, as well as one very large apex predator that wasn't a dinosaur, but could be just as terrifying. Garrett already mentioned what it was.
Spoiler.
Some of the dinosaurs from the island include Balaur, Bradycneme, Elopteryx, Enantiornithes, Gargantuavis, Heptasteornis, Magyarosaurus, Paludititan, Struthiosaurus transilvanicus.
Couldn't see Sabrina's air quotes on the Struthiosaurus.
Yes, we'll get to that. Telmatosaurus and Zalmoxes. Now, of course, we can't talk about dwarf dinosaurs and Hatseg Island without mentioning the Baron Franz Nopcsa, a wealthy man with many interests who pioneered a lot of dinosaur analysis and theories and was one of the first people to look at more than just the bones of dinosaurs. Like, he looked at the biology of dinosaurs. And Michael Benton mentioned him in the interview, of course, but we'll get a little bit more into Franz Nopcsa's life story as well. There's two main sources I used for this episode if you want to read more. We went into a lot of sources, but the two best ones were Traveler, Scholar, Political Adventurer, the memoirs of Franz Nopcsa. It's not really about his work on dinosaurs, but it's really interesting about his life, if you want to read more about his life. And then, of course, Dinosaurs and the Island Rule, the dwarf dinosaurs from Hatseg Island. That's that paper by Michael Benton and others that was published in 2010 that we talked a little bit about in our interview. So Hatseg Island was, again, a large island in the Late Cretaceous. Today, that area is the southern Carpathians, the mountains, and western Romania, and it's landlocked. The island is well known for its dwarf dinosaurs. That's that theory that Franz Nopcsa came up with. And the idea is that islands have limited resources, so animals grew smaller over time. Insular dwarfism. Hatseg Island's been estimated to be about 31,000 square miles or 80,000 square kilometers, and it was probably about 120 miles or 200 kilometers away from other land. Now, there have been a lot of estimates about the size of this island, and that's partly because of sea levels changing. A deep marine basin surrounded the island, and it had a subtropical climate with an average temperature of 68 to 77 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 to 25 degrees Celsius. There were rainy and dry seasons, but still a lot of tropical plants. The island also had rivers and lakes. Over 70 types of animals have been found from Hatseg Island, including fish, frogs, turtles, crocodilians, pterosaurs, birds, lizards, snakes, mammals, and then, of course, dinosaurs. There's not as many types of dinosaurs as there were in other areas around the same time, but that's probably because they were on an island. In other parts of the world, in the Late Cretaceous, like the Hell Creek Formation, the Lance Formation, the Horseshoe Canyon Formation, Nemegt Formation, etc., there's often 30 to 40 dinosaur taxa. Now, in Europe, formations from around the same time had as few as 2 to 3 taxa and as many as 13. It's possible, however, that not as many fossils have been collected from these European formations, so there could still be more taxa.
Yes, 70 animals is a lot.
Yes. I think we're going to talk about something like 12 types of dinosaurs, so that is on the lower end in terms of dinosaurs.
But just scratching the surface because there's so many other animals there as well.
Yeah. There's a number of formations in Hatseg Island, including the Sompetrou Formation, Densusa Chiula Formation, Sebesh Formation, Sard Formation, and Jibo Formation. Now, at the time of the Hatseg dinosaurs, most of what is now Europe was under the Chalk Seas, and what is now Eastern Europe was a chain of islands. And Hatseg there was probably one of those islands. In 2010, Michael Benton and Zoltan Siki analyzed the animals of Hatseg Island, And they mentioned the island rule, which was a term coined by Van Valen in 1973, where dwarfing or gigantism occurred on islands. And then, of course, Nopcsa published on the dwarf dinosaurs of the Hatseg Basin in 1914 and said it was due to their, quote, restrictive habitat. The authors looked closely at the dwarf dinosaurs of the formation, since some of those dinosaurs' dwarf status had been questioned in 2005 by Lelouf and then again in 2009 by Galton, and at recently published papers at the time of the area. Hatseg was also thought to have less diversity of dinosaurs than other areas, and there were several basal tetrapod lineages up to the end of the Cretaceous, which was unusual. Nopcsa and others suggested that the dinosaur faunas of Hatseg were impoverished, and that this was evidence they lived on an island. And impoverished here refers to the low diversity of dinosaurs. But it turns out that that was partly because of the limited collecting of fossils, and now we do know about more dinosaur species than before. Now, compared to other areas of the world, the dinosaur fauna was impoverished, but it was similar to all European faunas from around the same time. So it does turn out there was more diversity in this ecosystem than previously thought. This area, it was mountainous, and, quote, from the 2010 paper, tectonic evolution of the surrounding mountainous areas appears to have had significant impact upon the paleo-environmental evolution of the basin itself, promoting a shift towards wetter, more moist environments during the later part of the Maastrichtian. They found that based on stable isotopes, the island had this tropical setting, also known as a low-latitude paleogeographic setting. Not many plant fossils have been found, mostly spores and pollen and some leaf impressions, also some seeds and fruitifications. But they said the mesoflora, quote, suggests a semi-arid, seasonably variable climate. And there were also marshy ponds, floodplains, channels, and more.
Marshes with fruitifications.
Yeah. Hatseg Island probably existed between the Cenomanian to the Maastrichtian in the Late Cretaceous, about 100 million years ago to 66 million years ago. There were streams, again, climate was subtropical, rainy and dry seasons, tropical plants probably lived off of monsoons. Hatseg Island may have had also these, quote, occasional land bridges or shallow marine dispersal corridors to the European mainland or other emergent land masses of southern Europe. And when it became more shallow, that's when maybe other animals came to the island.
Or new dinosaurs.
Their type of animal, yes. Most vertebrates from the island were found in the fine-grained floodplain deposits, not channels, and that is different from other formations found with dinosaur fossils. In the paper, they said, quote, skeletons show evidence of disturbance, breakage, and weathering, and bone beds, whether of larger or smaller elements, show remarkable mixing of materials from many sources, some relatively fresh and others much abraded or eroded. Now, smaller vertebrates like amphibians and lizards were found in ponds. Crocodiles, turtles, and mammals were found in less marshy areas, and that could show some habitat preferences, but the dinosaurs were found all over. Now, Hatseg Island, it's not exactly the same as Hatseg Basin, since each island was a little bit different. Hatseg Island, quote, must have been significantly larger than the Hatseg Basin itself. Also, quote, Hatseg-type assemblages can be recognized all over the southwestern, western, and northwestern margin of the Transylvania Basin, thus significantly increasing the mappable area of this former land. So there's some differences in the animals you find in both, but there needs to be more study on this. The animals of Hatseg Island were a mix of, quote, late surviving relict members of phylogenetic lineages that can be traced back to the early Cretaceous and endemic taxa that speciated on the island itself, end quote. So you've got a mix of these kind of older looking animals and then also the animals that evolved while on the island. So now we'll talk about the dwarf dinosaurs specifically. Benton et al. Supported Nopcsa's dwarf island dinosaurs claim, that insular theory idea. Nopcsa suggested in around 1914, well, that's when it was officially suggested, that the dinosaurs lived on an island based on the low diversity of dinosaurs and the basal position of the specimens found. Most of these dinosaurs, they were from the end of the Cretaceous, but they looked like dinosaurs that came from the late Jurassic and early Cretaceous. The dinosaurs found were also smaller compared to their relatives from other areas. And Nopcsa also wrote in 1914 that turtles and crocodilians and other animals still reached, quote, their normal size. So why the dinosaurs?
The ones that could swim.
Now, at least 2 of the dinosaurs that Benton and others found in 2010 were, quote, dwarfs by progenesis, a form of paedomorphosis. That includes the sauropod Magyarosaurus, which was only about 20 feet or 6 meters long, small for a sauropod, the ornithopod Telmatosaurus, and possibly the ornithopod Zalmoxes. They said, quote, as adults, the sauropod Magyarosaurus and the ornithopod Telmatosaurus seem to have been about 1/2 the length of their close relatives from elsewhere. Now, others had proposed insular dwarfing based on Pleistocene mammals of the Mediterranean islands. This had been discussed by Forsyth Major in 1902, Bate in 1903, and also Bate in 1906. In 1964, Foster, quote, noted that small taxa generally became larger and large animals smaller. And then Van Valen named it the Island Rule in 1973. And sometimes this is also called Foster's Island Rule or Foster's Rule. Island Rule has been found in mammals, birds, and snakes, but not so much in lizards. Mayrie and others in 2004, 2006, and 2008 have said that there are too many exceptions to the term Island Rule, so we should stop using it. When it comes to the terms dwarf and giant, Benton et al. Said that there was no formal understanding of when an animal was a dwarf or giant, but often it meant, quote, 1/2 or 1/3, or twice or 3 times the normal size.
So you got to be at least double or half.
Yes.
And then you count as a giant or a dwarf.
Exactly. There's a few previous hypotheses for this island rule, which are no longer accepted, but they're fun to hear about, so we'll go over them. That includes the relict population idea, where giant rodents on islands are there from earlier populations, and then selection or the extinction of the mainland species led the island species to grow large. But there's not much evidence that smaller rodents displaced the larger ones on the mainland, and there are more differences in the giant island rodents compared to the mainland rodents. Plus, there are size changes in other animals, mammals, birds, and lizards. Another hypothesis was the reduced prey size on islands, where smaller prey has fewer other animals to compete with, so there's a lot of small prey. Predators then might grow smaller to better go after the small prey. But there's not much evidence that island dwarf predator animals are matched by island dwarf prey animals. Plus, that doesn't help explain why herbivorous animals are growing smaller because their size doesn't match the size of the plants that they eat. Then there's the sexual selection on islands idea, where some of the pressures on the mainland don't exist on the island, so animals are free to grow larger, but there's not enough evidence for this. Next is the optimal body size idea, where there's less pressure and animals can grow to the size best for their environment and their energy needs, but the optimal body size for mammals, there's just too many variables, and even related island species can be different sizes depending on the conditions of their islands. The last hypothesis that's no longer considered valid is the selection of immigrants for large size idea, where larger, stronger animals could swim to the islands from the mainland, but this is very hard to prove.
Yeah, and those are sort of a mix of what makes things larger and smaller, too, it sounds like.
Yes. Now, there are other hypotheses that are still considered to be valid. That includes the ecological release one, where animals on islands don't have the same pressure from competitors, predators, and parasites on the mainland. There's fewer species, so their body size can change. Now, birds became flightless on islands to save energy, for example, and because there's less competition and predation. Larger animals may also become smaller because there aren't as many predators, so being large is no longer an advantage.
Like if you're a sauropod.
Yes. The next is the niche expansion idea, where animals can expand to new diets and opportunities because there are fewer species on the island. For example, smaller animals may grow larger on islands to, quote, take over the roles of absent middle-sized animals. The next is the resource limitation on islands idea, where animals grow smaller so they can live off the land's resources. They can't migrate far away for more food. And last is the optimization of life history traits idea, where some animals have traits, quote, metabolic rate, gestation time, size at birth, age and size at maturity, birth and death rates, trophic level, home range size, and population density. And these things make them better suited to island life. And then they can change their size based on their circumstances, fill a niche or take advantage of either the presence or absence of certain competitors or competition. But it's really hard to find a predictable pattern for this.
Sounds like in general, the earlier ideas were very short-term sort of ideas, like the big ones can make it to the island and you instantly have big ones there.
Mm-hmm.
Or the small ones are better suited to the environment, so the small ones stick around. And then the later ideas are more about the ecology in general, where it's like, well, on an island, you have different pressures. So over time, they become these different sizes or they have these different features.
Kind of like when it comes to the science of dinosaurs, we started off with this narrower look. We're just looking at the bones, and now we look at what were their lifestyles like, and how did they move, and how did they grow. So it's just taking into account more factors.
Mm-hmm.
Animals on Hatseg Island span different periods of time. They're from different ages, and therefore they're part of different fauna. So it's really difficult to talk about trends on the island, like their sizes, because they all lived at different times with different animals. Oh, just as a side note, there is another dinosaur that was found in what's now Germany, Europasaurus, that's also thought to have been an island dwarf. Now I'll move on to Franz Nopcsa, who had, again, as we mentioned, a very interesting life. So the Baron Franz Nopcsa lived from 1877 to 1933. He was well known for describing dinosaur dwarfism, but he was also a wartime spy. And at one point, he even offered himself to be king of Albania, which Michael Benton also mentioned.
He really liked Albania. It was a whole thing.
Yes. Nopcsa was the oldest of 3 children, and he also spoke a ton of languages: Hungarian, Romanian, English, German, and French.
Wow.
Yes. He sometimes is called the father of modern paleontology, as he was the first person to study the biology of dinosaurs. According to Hans-Dieter Suess, Nopcsa founded paleophysiology. He was studying clues in the fossil to figure out how extinct animals' bodies functioned internally. That includes how fast or big did they grow, sexual dimorphism, were they warm-blooded. He also thought that dinosaurs may have been social and parental, like modern birds. Nopcsa was one of the first people in the 20th century to advocate that birds were descendants of dinosaurs. We have to say 20th century because we talk about Huxley all the time, who said the same thing. Nopcsa thought that birds came from small ground-dwelling dinosaurs, though it turned out that wasn't the case. He also suggested the crests and horns of hadrosaurs were for sexual selection, like a peacock's tail. He compared pelvis and hind limbs of crocodiles to learn how running flight evolved in early birds, and he watched brooding birds and figured the hatchlings couldn't defend themselves, so dinosaurs must have done some parental care, which was another new idea of the time. And he studied dinosaur tracks and how the big toe evolved to better understand the origin of birds, and he realized that animals, they had different ways of flying.
Like how the big toe evolved.
Yeah.
Sounds very specific, but I assume it's important.
Nopcsa also analyzed slices of bone under a microscope to study cell structure. So he's one of the first people to contribute to paleohistology, and he figured out which bones were most useful to analyze. And that's how he determined that the sauropod Magyarosaurus wasn't a juvenile, but rather a dwarf dinosaur.
Wow. So that was, Benton later sort of verified that.
Yes.
But I didn't realize Nopcsa was actually working on that way back in the early 1900s. That's impressive.
Yes, he had a lot of interesting ideas. Some of them, we found aren't correct, but, at the time, just the fact that he was coming up with all these ideas when people were still mostly just looking at the bones, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
One of his ideas was that the overdevelopment of the hypophysis gland made dinosaurs too large and eventually led to their extinction. So that's one of those that didn't quite pan out, but still cool. Nopcsa worked very hard throughout his life. Sometimes, though, he was ill, and he had to stay in bed for a whole year once because of his illness. But he still published a lot of papers, including one where he adopted the theory of continental drift. And He didn't mention Alfred Wegener at the time, but he did send him a letter that said, quote, "Meanwhile, I would congratulate you for the confirmation of your drift hypothesis, and I'm glad to be one of the initial supporters of your hypothesis." In today's terms, we might say that Nopcsa was bipolar. He called it shattered nerves. So he was very productive sometimes, and other times not as much. He published over 186 research papers on paleontology, geology, and Albanian studies. His geology studies of the Balkans led to a theory of plate tectonics, which was way ahead of its time by about 40 years, and his paleontology work was donated to the British Museum in London after his death. Despite all his accomplishments, though, his grave is unmarked.
Really?
Mm-hmm. There's hope to restore his castle and make it a center for scientific research and to create a large museum. Under communism, the books in his library were burned.
That's a terrible loss.
Yes. There's also not enough money to restore his castle for now, but there is a replica of Magyarosaurus outside of a current museum in the area that is anatomically correct. It was made by a Canadian artist. They did a Kickstarter campaign to cover the shipping costs. It's not clear why Nopcsa was so unknown for so long. It could be his eccentricities, or it could be because he was gay. He was openly gay at a time when that wasn't really a thing.
Wow, I didn't realize he was openly gay. That's really interesting.
Yeah, a lot of people knew that about him at the time, but it didn't really matter, possibly because he was an aristocrat.
Yeah.
It could also be he was considered an outsider scientist. He kind of thought he was above society. Also, Nopcsa never visited the US or Canada even there was a great dinosaur rush out to Alberta in the 1920s. But at that point, he was pretty poor and he had to sell his fossils. He also didn't really teach, so he didn't have many academic advocates. So it could be a lot of little things, even though he was such a big figure in paleontology. So I'll talk about the dinosaurs that Nopcsa described. He described multiple species of dinosaurs and reptiles. Before I get to the dinosaurs, one of the reptiles is a turtle, Kalakibotian Biamidai, which means beautiful box of Biamide, and it refers to his boyfriend's bottom because the shape of the shell reminded him of it.
It was like a peach emoji.
A little bit. Franz Nopcsa's family owned estates in the area of Hatseg Island, and he noticed that close relatives of Hatseg dinosaurs in England, Germany, and North America were much bigger. He first noticed them in 1895 when his younger sister, Iona, found dinosaurs near their family estate at Sutzel in Transylvania when she was 12 years old. She was walking along a riverbank. At the time, all of this was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and now it is Western Romania. Nopcsa sent the fossils that his sister had found to Professor Eduard Suess, and he asked him for advice about dinosaur osteology, and Suess said, "Study them."
That sounds like something a paleontologist would say today, too.
Yeah. So he did, and then he attended the University of Vienna, and when he was 20, in 1897, he first reported on these fossils, and he continued to collect the fossils and write about them until World War I. Then the Romanian government seized the family estate in 1920. He stopped collecting, but he kept publishing on the fossils until he committed suicide, and we'll get to his death a little bit later. Nopcsa, even though he did attend university, before that he was self-taught. He read books on geology, physiology, anatomy, neurology, and he even contacted scientists around Europe asking for more books. He excavated fossils, he prepared them with homemade glue. Based on jaw mechanics of lizards and alligators, he rearticulated the fossil jaw his sister first found, and he was one of the first people to compare dinosaurs to living animals. The first paper he wrote was when he named Telmatosaurus. That's that crushed skull that his sister found. And he published that when he was 22. In addition to describing the bones, he tried to reconstruct the soft tissues and muscle and brain. He did have a tendency to be arrogant, so he wasn't always easy to be around. He knew he was smart. He was also an aristocrat. That gave him a lot of privileges. There's an example of his arrogant behavior where he told Louis told how great and important his work was, considering his age.
That's one of those backhanded compliments.
Yes. As we mentioned, in 1914, Nopcsa wrote about insular dwarfism. He wrote, quote, "While the turtles, crocodilians, and similar animals of the late Cretaceous reached their normal size, the dinosaurs almost always remain below their normal size." At one point, Nopcsa became head of Hungary's geological survey, but he was a little too arrogant and he was forced to resign in 1925. He owed a lot of money at that point, and he sold his fossils to the Natural History Museum in London. Then his health got worse, his debts piled up, and he became depressed. Apparently, after he quit, he went on a motorcycle journey across Europe with Bahamid Doda, that's his secretary and his lover. From the end of World War I to the 1970s, no one studied the dinosaur fossils in the area. Then, starting in 1977, Grigorescu led summer camps every year for geology students to excavate fossils and study them. And these studies got more geologists and paleontologists interested in the fossils, and more people started studying Hateg Island. Now, I've mentioned little bits of Nopcsa's personal life. We'll get into a few more details of his life and his death. Nopcsa was a great scholar, but he's kind of hot and cold as a person. He's been described as intelligent, curious, a keen observer, and diligent. His German language biographer, Gert Robel, wrote, quote, "If we look back upon Nopcsa's life, we can observe the many and extremely diverse aspects in his being, including many a contradiction. His ingenious intuition was in stark contrast to his inability to understand and appreciate the motives of others. His insensitivity and egoism were in contrast to his devotion to the Albanians, his critical intelligence to his emotional bias." A quote from the intro to his memoirs says, quote, "Indeed, Nopcsa may not always appear congenial or likable to the reader. He was constantly driven by a craving for recognition and prestige, was often irritable and arrogant, and on occasion openly anti-Semitic.
Yeesh.
Some of these traits may be understandable in view of his background and milieu, but many of his motives and reactions remain difficult to fathom," end quote.
Yikes. That's not a glowing review of his behavior.
True. Now, Nopcsa's boyfriend was Bahamid Dada, and they met when Nopcsa traveled in Romania. Nopcsa was openly gay before that was socially acceptable, as we mentioned, but being an aristocrat, that did help. Although he was openly gay, when the two of them went to Vienna, he told everyone that Bahamid was his live-in secretary for propriety. In 1933, when Nopcsa was 55 years old, almost 56, he committed suicide. By then, he'd lost his land, his money, and his family home. It's thought that he, quote, drugged Doda with sleeping powder and shot him before committing suicide. In a note, it said, quote, "I did not wish to leave him behind sick in misery and without a penny because he would have suffered too much. I wish to be cremated." So Nopcsa was 55, and his boyfriend was 45 at the time.
Oof. I hope Doda knew what was coming.
It seems like maybe not.
Oof.
Now, on April 26th of 1933, Nopcsa sent his housekeeper on an errand, and then that's when he shot Doda and then himself. And in his suicide note, he said he had a nervous collapse. The two of them were laid to rest in Vienna at the same moment, at the same hour. There's an ash tree now over Doda's grave. Nopcsa wrote, "I wish to be burned," in his note. And the room where Nopcsa shot himself is now a real estate office.
Oh, bad.
Going back to the unmarked grave, there's just not a lot about him. Although at least we know where his castle is. Nopcsa, of course, did a lot of other work, as we mentioned. He loved Albania. He started by studying the geology and geography of Albania, and then he moved on to customs, languages, and religions. He often dressed like Albanians when he was conducting his studies so as not to be recognized, and he published more than 50 journal articles about Albanian folklife. Albania was between Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, and Austria wanted an accurate geographical and cultural map, so Nopcsa became a spy. That's when he hired Doda in 1906 to be, his secretary, and he wrote in his journal that Doda was, quote, "the only person who has truly loved me." In 1907, the two of them traveled the mountains in Albania, and they ended up being hostages of a well-known bandit, Mustafa Lida. They were dressed as Albanians, which Nopcsa wrote in his memoirs was, quote, much better than in European dress, because people didn't stare as much and it was easier to talk to the locals. They made it to Mustafa Lida's home, which was full of weapons, and Nopcsa wrote that he was a large man, Lida, who was not calm but, quote, was not overly agitated, simply decisive. Nopcsa offered to help him fulfill a wish of his, quote, without referring precisely to what I meant. Now, Lida had wanted to become an army major, but the Inspector General of Macedonia had prevented it. Now, Lida then betrayed his guests, Nopcsa and Doda, and made them his prisoners, saying he was demanding 10,000 Turkish pounds for their release. Nopcsa managed to secretly send a letter asking the army major of Merdida for help in the form of either 500 armed men or opium and 20 men. Nopcsa also hid a razor under the carpet of his room as a backup in case a guard was going to be sent to sleep in their room and try to take their weapons away. His plan was to kill the guard, climb out of the tower with the sheets and carpets tied together.
Wow, really going fantasy land escape there.
He was ready. But with some help, Nopcsa changed Lida's mind about the ransom and offered to get him his title as army major. And he convinced Lida to hand Nopcsa over to the Turkish authorities as an Austro-Hungarian spy. Should also mention, Michael Benton mentioned this, that Nopcsa may also have been a spy for the British. This is during the war. Anyways, they made a very tiring trek over nearly a week. Just before they reached their destination, Nopcsa got a note to the consulate, and everything worked out for Nopcsa. Doda's father had heard about the whole ordeal and showed up with 10 armed men with 40 more nearby, and he wanted to shoot Lida, but Doda and Nopcsa prevented him from doing so. And then at that point, everybody knew what was going on, and Lida went back home. Nopcsa wrote, quote, of course I was unable to help him any further.
Was he still planning on helping him after he held him prisoner?
It's unclear, but this just gives you an idea of his adventurous lifestyle.
Yeah.
Now, Nopcsa did not like the Ottoman Turks that were ruling Albania. He wanted Albania to be an independent protectorate of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
So he wanted the empire he's from to be controlling Albania.
And he did also make it clear he'd accept the crown of Albania if his plan of guerrilla warfare against the Turks succeeded. Eventually, Albania did become independent in 1912, but Nopcsa did not become king.
Oh, shucks.
He did offer at an international conference. The conference was about newly independent Albania. He offered to marry a wealthy American heiress who would want to be royalty in order to become the king, but that wasn't accepted.
That's a weird way to rationalize it. I'll marry an American woman and then we'll rule Albania together. You'd think he would marry an Albanian woman.
He was looking for somebody with money.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. The German prince, Wilhelm von Wade, became the sovereign prince instead, although that didn't last long, and then World War I broke out.
So still it was an outsider who became the king.
Yes.
I guess you were telling me the other day about how all these different nobility around Europe were all related.
Yes.
So it makes some sense, I suppose.
During World War I, Nopcsa joined the Imperial Austro-Hungarian Army as an officer, and then he led espionage missions in Romania. He was a commander of a company of Albanian volunteers in 1916, and then in 1918, Romania took over Transylvania and confiscated Nopcsa's lands and money. And when he tried to visit one of his family's lands later, he was nearly beaten to death by some rebellious peasants, so he went back to Vienna. And as a side note, just about his life, he also lived as a Romanian shepherd in the Carpathian Mountains for a time.
Wow. Going on a, what would we call that today? Like a retreat?
Yeah, something
without
like
technology and connections to...
He went to unplug.
Yeah, exactly.
Nopcsa wrote memoirs, which is how I got a lot of these quotes and stories about his adventurous life. He started writing his memoirs before the end of World War I. His memoirs cover 1897 to 1917, when Nopcsa turned 40. He lost his 1918 diary, which might be why it ends in 1917, and he completed writing his memoirs around 1929. Stadium Press in Budapest offered to publish the Hungarian translation, but Nopcsa had so many last-minute changes, the publisher got tired and withdrew their offer, and then negotiations for the German language version broke down, so his memoirs ended up not being published for 70 years.
Wow.
Yes. Again, going to that, he's not the easiest to work with idea.
And that he's relatively unknown, because if people were really interested in him, I'm sure they would have pushed a little faster than 70 years.
Yes. Before Nopcsa killed himself, he wrote a letter to his colleague, Professor Norbert Jockel, with a list of manuscripts about Albania that he was leaving behind and a request to get those published. But for financial reasons, they weren't published. And also, the professor was murdered by Nazis in early 1942. In his memoirs, Nopcsa's memoirs, he doesn't get too personal, at least around his love life. For example, he writes, quote, "My private life in London carried on calmly and uneventfully, with behind me taking care of my daily needs, such as strawberry jam, etc."
What?
Yeah.
Strawberry jam, etc.
Yes, that's how he talks about his boyfriend. He also refers to his bachelor apartment in his memoirs.
I guess he's not married, so maybe that technically makes him a bachelor.
Yeah, could be. Just some highlights from his memoirs. In 1903, while traveling through Albania, one day at dawn, he was shot at. He wrote, quote, "The bullet went right through my hat and grazed my head, but did not injure me."
Oof.
Yes, so he leapt off his horse and he tried to fire back, but he couldn't see who did it.
So just firing randomly.
Yeah. In hopes that he would hit the person who tried to hit him. In the part between the annexation and the Balkan War, 1910 to 1912, Nopcsa went to Berlin to lecture at the German Geological Society of Berlin and saw the dinosaur remains from German East Africa. And one geologist asked him if he was related to the dinosaur specialist, the Baron Nopcsa. So, shows how well known he was.
I wonder if he was looking at Spinosaurus.
He didn't mention which dinosaur, he just said dinosaur remains. There was not much about dinosaurs in his memoirs. Spinosaurus, I don't think, was in Germany by 1912.
Yeah, you're right, because they had to wait till after World War I to finally get them out.
Yes. Now, later, Nopcsa became an external member of the Geographical Society in London and an honorary member of the London Zoological Society, the Academy of Bologna, the Geographical Society in Vienna, and the Geological Institute in Vienna. He was also an honorary member of the Hungarian Geological Society and a full member of the Hungarian Academy of Science. So it seems like he was fairly well respected. In 1929, at an exhibit at the British Museum, he published on skeletal remains, and he wrote, quote, "This piece was especially interesting because it was the first more or less complete skull of an Acanthopholis dinosaur."
What's an Acanthopholis?
It's a small armored dinosaur. Clubless.
Sounds like a Thyreophorian. I'm a fan.
Yeah, Notosaurid.
Oh, it's only a Notosaurid, not an Ankylosaurid.
Yes. Those three items were all I could find related to dinosaurs in his memoirs.
Wow.
It's mostly about his adventures.
Fortunately, other people wrote about it, and he wrote about it in publications, right?
Yes,
So you can get it elsewhere.
Exactly. All right, we have covered Nopcsa, we have covered Hateg Island in general. Now let's get to the heart of this, which is, of course, the animals. Hateg Island dinosaurs, as we mentioned, they tended to be more basal. That includes Magyarosaurus, Telmatosaurus, Zalmoxes, Struthiosaurus. The ornithopods of Europe from the Late Cretaceous seem to be relictual. They're survivors of a once diverse group. This may mean that these types of dinosaurs used to be more common, and then when the land got split up into islands, their range was split, or they island hopped from the mainland. It's unclear what exactly happened. As we mentioned, Magyarosaurus, Zalmoxes, and Telmatosaurus are considered to be dwarfs. The ankylosaur, Struthiosaurus, as well as an unnamed pterosaur, were smaller than expected that were found on the island, but it's unclear if those specimens are adults or subadults.
So there was a small pterosaur on the island.
Yes, but it's unnamed. The Hatseg dromaeosaurids and troodontids are small, but they're also about the same size as their relatives in Asia and North America. But the crocodilians, turtles, and mammals are all about the same size as their relatives from other parts of the world. And then we've got that giant pterosaur, Hateg, which was large with a wingspan of about 39 feet or 12 meters. Now, the main formations of Hatseg Island include the Sompetru Formation from the early Maastrichtian, the Densa Chiula Formation, which is from the Late Cretaceous. There's a lot of material that came from volcanoes there, not as many fossils. And the Sebish Formation, also from the Maastrichtian.
So mostly around 70 million years ago, maybe 80.
Yeah, at least the main formations there, yeah. Getting into the dinosaurs, we'll start with Balaur, which was our dinosaur of the day in episode 297, so if you want more details, you can head over to that episode. I'll just quickly say that the type species is Balaur bondok, and the full name means stocky dragon. It was a theropod estimated to be around 6 to 7 feet or 1.8 to 2.1 meters long, and it's closely related to Velociraptor.
Yes, it's about the same size as Velociraptor too.
Yeah. Now, the holotype is an articulated partial skeleton. The carpals and metacarpals were fused, so it only had 2 functional fingers, and that's different from other dromaeosaurids that had 3. It also had 2 claws on each foot and features in the legs that made it likely to have been able to have powerful kicks.
Oh, that's right. I remember that one now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the double clawed feet was really interesting.
Yes. And it was secondarily flightless. Next is Elopteryx. The type species is Elopteryx Nopcsa.
Hey, I wasn't aware of anything that got named after him.
Yeah, there we go. Now, there's a lot of debate over the phylogeny of Elopteryx. Most recently, it's considered to be an alvarosaurid, but it's also considered to be a nomum dubium. Nopcsa found these fossils. They were small fragments that were later acquired by the British Museum of Natural History, and then it was named by Charles William Andrews in 1913. The holotype is a left femur, and then later a second upper left thigh bone fragment was found and referred to Elopteryx, as well as a distal left tibiotarsus.
So only pieces of the top and bottom of the leg.
Yes, that's why it's dubious.
Yeah, it's not great.
Andrews originally thought that it was a seabird. The genus name Elopteryx means marshwing, and the species name, of course, is in honor of Nopcsa. And there's been a lot of lumping and splitting of the fossils for Elopteryx, Bradycneme, and Heptasteornis. So the next one we'll talk about then is Bradycneme. The type species is Bradycneme draculae.
I think I remember that one because it's from Transylvania.
Yes. It's a theropod. It's known from a partial right lower leg. It's been most recently classified as an alvarosaurid, but originally it was thought to be a giant owl. Now, if it were an owl, it would have been stout and it would have been about 6.5 feet or 2 meters tall.
This thing should be a lot of indications that maybe dinosaurs and birds are related when every time they find a dinosaur bone, at first they're thinking, this looks like a bird bone.
Yeah, a giant bird.
Yeah.
Bradycneme was named in 1975 by Colin James Oliver Harrison and Cyril Alexander Walker. Originally, it was assigned to Elopteryx. This holotype, it's a wide distal tibiotarsus. It's in the leg. That's about 38 millimeters wide.
So a little over an inch and a half, maybe.
The genus name, Bradycneme, means ponderous leg, and the species name means the dragon in Romania and refers to Dracula.
I didn't realize Dracula meant dragon.
Yeah, me either.
Little bonus fun fact in there.
Then there's Heptasteornis. The type species is Heptasteornis andrewsi. It's a dubious alvarosaurid, also described in 1975 by Harrison and Walker, and they thought it was a giant prehistoric owl.
A lot of owls.
It had been included as part of the holotype of Elopteryx, but that turned out to be an error. Nopcsa also found these fossils, but it's considered to be a nomum dubium because, again, only fragments have been found. That includes 2 broken distal tibiotarsi, a large bone in the leg. The genus name, Heptasteornis, means 7 cities or 7 castles, and that's the common name for the region in Transylvania where it was found. The species name is in honor of C.W. Andrews, who named Elopteryx. Next are the Enantiornithes that were found. That includes a nearly complete right humerus and end of a left humerus that was found, as well as evidence of colonial nesting that shows that they buried their eggs. But there's not too much else to say. Then there's Gargantuavis. The type species is Gargantuavis phyloinos. It was a large basal bird. It's actually one of the largest known birds from the Mesozoic, and it's estimated to weigh about 310 pounds or 140 kilograms.
Holy cow, that is very big.
Yes.
I wonder, that's heavier than some birds I've heard claim to be the heaviest birds ever. So that estimate must vary depending on who's looking at it.
And which specimen you're looking at, because fossils have been found in northern Spain, southern France, and Romania. The first fossils were found in France in 1995, and then it was described in 1998 by Buffetat and Lelouf. But only fragments are known. No skull has been found, but then a pelvis was found in 2019 from Hateg Island, and it had a broad pelvis, which shows it wasn't a fast runner. Also based on the femur, they're saying it wasn't adapted to running. However, Gargantuavis grew quickly. That's based on bone histology, and then it slowed down its growth for about 10 years, and then it became skeletally mature. And this pattern is similar to kiwi birds.
Oh, okay. Yeah, now that you mentioned it might be a flightless bird, the things I've read about other birds being the largest ever might still apply because they're talking about flying birds.
Oh, yes. The genus name Gargantuavis refers to Gargantua, the giant and main character in the 16th century French novel The Life of Gargantua and of Pantagruel. The species name, Phyloinos, means one who likes wine, and that's because the fossils were first found around vineyards and wineries.
That's funny. A giant that likes wine.
Who doesn't, I guess. Then there's the dinosaur Magyarosaurus, which was our dinosaur of the day in episode 262, so you can get even more details if you head over there. And there's 2 species. There's Magyarosaurus dacus and Magyarosaurus hungaricus, which the hungaricus one is bigger, but it hasn't been fully studied yet. The fossils are more of a rare find. It's possible that Magyarosaurus hungaricus was from a time when sea levels were lower and they could immigrate and then have enough resources because the sea levels were lower that made the island larger, or maybe they're stray animals from nearby larger land areas. Magyarosaurus, however, was a dwarf sauropod with dermal armor.
Nice.
Yeah, it was about 16 to 20 feet or 5 to 6 meters long, which is small for a sauropod.
Oh yeah, that's tiny. Especially for a Cretaceous sauropod.
Yes. And it's possible that it was small by paedomorphosis, which means it kept its ancestral juvenile characteristics. It weighed about 1.1 tons, which also is much smaller than other sauropods, and much smaller than other titanosaurs, because Magyarosaurus is also a titanosaur. The bone histology of Magyarosaurus found that these specimens were fully mature and therefore smaller than other sauropods. There's a, quote, extremely reduced growth rate. Enough individuals have been found to represent a growth series, and Magyarosaurus is closely related to Rhepetosaurus, Nemegtosaurus, Malawisaurus, and Trigonosaurus, but obviously is much smaller. The genus name Magyarosaurus means Magyar lizard, and Magyar refers to a group of people who are native to Hungary. Next, there's, in quotes, Megalosaurus hungaricus. Megalosaurus was our dinosaur of the day in episode 47, and we do talk a lot about that dinosaur in general if you want to head over there. But as for Megalosaurus hungaricus, in 1902, Nopcsa named Megalosaurus hungaricus based on 2 teeth found in Transylvania.
Oh, jeez.
Those teeth have since been lost.
Oh, double OGs.
That's why it's in quotes. So now it's an indeterminate theropod.
Yeah, and at that time, Megalosaurus was a pretty big wastebasket taxon anyway. So it already probably wasn't really a Megalosaurus.
Plus, it's just so hard to know a dinosaur based on teeth.
Yeah.
Next is Paludititan. The type species is Paludititan naladzensis. It was a titanosaur, estimated to be about 20 feet or 6 meters long. The shoulder height is 6 foot 7 inches or about 2 meters. This dinosaur was found in 2002 on a Belgian-Romanian expedition. They found a partial skeleton with no skull. That included vertebrae, chevrons, the right half of the pelvis, left ischium, lower end of the right thigh bone, and 2 toe claws. All these bones probably came from one individual because they were found close together. Gregory Paul thought that this specimen could be the same as Magyarosaurus dacus. The fossils do look a lot like Magyarosaurus fossils, and there are some overlapping fossils, but they were found in different locations and they don't share any unique traits or synapomorphies. Paludititan had short, erect, neural spines along its tail. It was described in 2010 by Zoltan Siski and others, and at the time it was the most complete sauropod found in Romania. The genus name means marsh titan, Paludititan, and the species name, Nalazensis, refers to where it was found. Next is another dinosaur in quotes, Struthiosaurus transilvanicus. It actually doesn't have a proper name, and that's why it has the quotes around it. Struthiosaurus austriacus was named in 1871 by Bunzel for a small isolated fragment that was found in Austria, and it was thought to be an ankylosaur. Nopcsa compared the Hatseg fossils with Struthiosaurus austriacus and other European ankylosaurs, and then he referred material to Bunzel's Struthiosaurus as Struthiosaurus transilvanicus. Coombs and Marianska, however, consider Struthiosaurus austriacus to be a nomen dubium.
I see.
So the genus name Struthiosaurus means ostrich lizard, and that's because it was thought to have this bird-like head.
Not to be confused with Struthiomimus, which is the bird mimic.
Yes.
And looks a lot more like a bird than a nodosaur.
Our next dinosaur is Telmatosaurus. That was a dinosaur of the day in episode 277, so you can go back to that if you want to hear even more details. But quickly, the type species is Telmatosaurus transilvanicus. It's the first dinosaur that Nopcsa named. It's a basal hadrosaur. It had narrow dentary teeth, and it was about 16 feet or 5 meters long and weighed about 1,100 pounds or 500 kilograms. The holotype was crushed, but it did have a long skull. The largest dentary found has about 30 tooth positions. It had dental batteries, as well as narrow diamond-shaped teeth, and a long arched blade-like neural spine. The femur was also slightly bowed. Compared to Maiasaura, another hadrosaur, the smallest Telmatosaurus specimens were smaller than young nesting Maiasaura, and the adult Telmatosaurus specimens were slightly more robust than Maiasaura individuals that were roughly the same size, though those Maiasaura individuals that were about the same size as the adult Telmatosaurus were probably young subadult Maiasaura. Telmatosaurus is smaller than more basal iguanodonts like Ouranosaurus and Iguanodon bernissartensis, and it had teeth with features like juvenile Ouranosaurus and Iguanodon. These maxillary teeth, again, were narrow and diamond-shaped, and the dentary teeth were wider and asymmetrical and small. All of this helps support the idea of dwarfing by paedomorphosis, where sometimes you keep juvenile traits even as an adult. It's also possibly via progenesis, which is the retention of ancestral juvenile characteristics by earlier maturation in the descendant. So you keep your juvenile characters even though you mature a little earlier. As an example, with Telmatosaurus, it may have finished developing its teeth earlier than its larger close relatives. Telmatosaurus has been found with a non-cancerous tumor in the jaw. It was benign. The tumor was in the early stages of development, so probably wasn't too painful for that particular dinosaur. Now, before Telmatosaurus, this type of tumor, ameloblastoma, had been found in humans, mammals, and some modern reptiles, but not dinosaurs. Because Telmatosaurus is a basal hadrosaur, it may mean that hadrosaurs were more prone to tumors than other dinosaurs. Now, this particular Telmatosaurus specimen died before it was an adult. Only 2 lower jaws are known, so it's unclear how it died. It's possible that the tumor indirectly caused its death. Maybe it made it appear weaker to a predator or something like that. And that's based on the idea of modern predators often going for weaker or more vulnerable prey. So poor Telmatosaurus. The genus name Telmatosaurus means marsh lizard. And again, we get into even more details on that dinosaur in episode 277. The last dinosaur I'll mention is Zalmoxes. The type species is Zalmoxes robustus. It's known as Zalmoxes now, but at first it was thought to be Maclodon robustum. It was described in 1899 by Franz Nopcsa. Nopcsa referred to Maclodon, an ornithopod named by Seeley that was found in Austria. He referred to part of the material as Maclodon susi and part of it as Maclodon robustum. Then later in 1915, he said that Maclodon may be the same as Rhabdodon and that the differences were due to sexual dimorphism. Nopcsa compared the fossils with other ornithopods from Europe and North America, like Camptosaurus, and found it to be similar to Rhabdodon that was found in France. In 1990, George Olszewski corrected the name to Rhabdodon robustus instead of robustum. And then Zalmoxes robustus was named by Weishampel and others in 2003 because they found enough differences to make it its own dinosaur.
Split it out from Rhabdodon.
Yes. Another species was also named in 2003, Zalmoxes shiporum. The species name shiporum is for the Albanian name for Albanians. Both of these species were found in the Hatseg Basin. In 2009, an analysis of the specimens found differences between the two species were not due to growing or sexual dimorphism. They were also found together in several localities. Zalmoxes is a bipedal herbivore. It had a large triangular head and a beak. Subadults have been found on Hateg Island that range from 6.6 to 7.9 feet or 2 to 2.4 meters long. Zalmoxes shiporum is a larger one. A subadult has been found that's 8.2 feet or 2.5 meters long. There's also an unnamed species with an adult, and that one's 9.5 feet or 2.9 meters long.
It's a monster.
Yes.
Almost 10 feet long.
So Zalmoxes robustus may have been a bit of a dwarf dinosaur, but the other species don't really seem to be.
So they're similar to some of the relatives elsewhere, I guess.
Yeah.
Ornithopods do get a lot bigger than that, but not all of them.
Well, over time, Zalmoxes got more teeth. It went from 8 to 10 tooth positions in the jaw. The deltopectoral crest also got longer, the tibia would get more robust, and the hind limb proportions would change. It would go from having a relatively short femur to having a femur about as long or longer than the tibia.
That's not good for sprinting.
No. Zalmoxes is part of the family Rhabdodontidae, along with Maclodon and Rhabdodon. The genus name refers to the Dacian deity Zalmoxes, who retreated in a crypt for 3 years to be resurrected on the 4th year. And they're saying that's similar to how these fossils were liberated. Zalmoxes was also a slave of Pythagoras, who traveled to Dacia and became a deity. Then the species name, robustus, refers to its robust build. I did say that was the last dinosaur, but that's because this next one's a little less specific. It's about dinosaur egg nests that have also been found in Hatseg. There were 14 eggs found in 1989, and these eggs were in 4 linear clutches, which each clutch had 2 or 4 eggs. The eggs were subspherical, and the eggshell is about 2.4 millimeters thick, and it had this tuberculated pattern. So the size, shape, and texture of those eggs are similar to those found in eggs found in southern France. And embryonic material of a hadrosaur has been associated with those eggs, possibly of Telmatosaurus. All right, that's it for the dinosaurs of Hatseg Island. But as we mentioned, there were some other amazing animals that have been found from this area.
One in particular.
Yes, the pterosaur. So of course, we have to talk about Hatsegopteryx. The type species is Hatsegopteryx thambema. It was a giant Asdargid pterosaur and one of the biggest found. It was named in 2002 by Eric Buffetta and others, based on parts of the skull and humerus, and it was stocky and powerful. It's known from partial limb bones, the neck bone, and parts of the skull. It had a really large neck vertebra, which means that it had a proportionally short, stocky neck. It wouldn't have twisted its neck. It was probably the apex predator of the island. Its head was around 6.5 to 10 feet, or 2 to 3 meters long.
What?
Yeah.
That's ludicrous.
And the neck was around 5 to 10 feet, or 1.5 to 3 meters long. And its estimated wingspan was 33 to 39 feet, or 10 to 12 meters. It could probably fly. So very large, very scary. The holotype includes 2 fragments from the back of the skull and a damaged part of the left humerus. Originally, this animal was thought to be a theropod back in 1991. Yeah,
when you find something that big,
yeah,
you might not think this is a flying creature.
Hateg had a wide skull with large muscular attachments. It had bones in the skull that were spongy instead of hollow. So it had these stout, robust skull bones. Some sources say the skull was estimated to be about 5 feet or 1.6 meters long.
That sounds a lot more reasonable than 6.5 to 10 feet.
Still giant.
Yeah, it's still crazy.
The bones in the skull were full of small pits and hollows, and that would make the skull weigh less. And you see this with wing bones as well. The skull was sturdy and stress-resistant and also lightweight. As you mentioned, the neck vertebra, it was short and robust. It was about 12 inches or 30 centimeters long. And pterosaurs in general have 9 neck vertebrae. This neck on Hateg probably had a lot of muscles. Hateg had some similarities with Quetzalcoatlus. It also had wing bones like other flying pterosaurs, so that means it could fly. It was probably a generalist predator. It may have gone for prey that was too large to swallow whole. We see some modern storks do this with their beaks. Also with flamingos. The genus name Hateg means Hatseg basin wing, and the species name Thambema means terror monster.
I had no idea that storks ate flamingos. That's crazy.
Yes. Birds are crazy.
They are dinosaurs indeed.
Now, pterosaurs in general had wings formed by membranes that stretched between their elongated finger to their legs. They also had many teeth, and they started off small, although obviously some of them grew quite large. Many pterosaurs lived around water, and many of them ate fish. Others ate fruit or were filter feeders, or they crushed their food as predators. And like the dinosaurs, pterosaurs also went extinct around the KPG extinction event. Now, Hateg, it was the largest pterosaur found so far on Hateg Island, but it's not the only one. Other asdarchids pterosaurs include Urasdarco and Albadraco, as well as an unnamed one that's based on a neck vertebra that was medium-sized and robust. And then, of course, there were other animals that lived on the island, and that included mammals that are mostly rodent-like ones, as well as insectivores, crocodiliforms, amphibians, including frogs, turtles, fish, and squamates. There's a lot going on in this island. For those of you who listen to our Dinosaur of the Day segment and you like it, please consider becoming a patron. We take new Dinosaur of the Day requests from our patrons and offer a bunch of other perks as well. So check out our page at patreon.com/iknowdino or click the link on the left.